Hello everyone and welcome to Smoking the Possum Pack, a series where I talk about everything I like and everything I don't like. Basically, just one autistic kid talking about his hyperfixations for way too long. And what better way to start talking about hyperfixations for way too long than a multi-part series about Skyrim. This is going to be the first of a few parts where we play each individual faction, then the main quest, then I do a few of the side quests, then the DLC for Skyrim. Our first episode is The Companions. We start with Jaraza Duskmane, our companion's playthrough. He's a young and hardy Khajiit raised in Skyrim, intent on becoming the province's greatest pugilist. Naturally, we start off in Helgen. I'm not using any alternate start mods here. I'm playing fully natural, except for a few Creation Club creations. I choose Hadvar, then choose the Warrior Stone, and then I do my regular grind before starting the main quest. Once I get over the hill and towards Whiterun, I immediately beeline it towards the giant that the companions are fighting. I land a few punches and Ayla calls me a good boy and sends me on my way to Jorrvaskr. Now, this is one of those things where if I hadn't beelined it to the giant, I probably would have got there late and then been accosted by Ayla for not doing anything. It's not exactly the best introduction to a faction, especially considering that someone first playing the game wouldn't even know about this event occurring. Walking through the streets of Whiterun, we eventually reach Jorrvaskr, the ancient mead hall of the Companions, originally a group of 200 who joined Ysgramor to do a little colonizing, and kill a few elves on the way. Anyway, when we enter, we see two members of the guild boxing in the dining hall. This goes on for what feels like an eternity. It's sped up on your screen, but I sat through this whole thing just to see who wins, and it was literally watching grass grow. I've seen this quite a few times, and sometimes it'll glitch out and one of them will pull a sword on the other, and at that point they'll just start wailing on the other with it. After 5 minutes of watching Skyrim boxing, Jaraza goes downstairs to meet Godlike Whitemane, the guy who's totally not the leader and definitely not in charge. He just makes all the decisions for the guild, is the voice of the faction, and can name you the successor of the faction on a whim. Jaraza says he wants to join them, and Vilka starts having a fit because Jaraza doesn't have enough clout, apparently. Bear in mind, he says that no matter what you've done in the game, you could have literally killed Alduin, and he acts like you're just some chump off the street. Anyways, Kodlak, the totally not leader, whom Vilkas calls master, decides I should definitely join the cause, and just need to test my strength against Vilkas. This starts Take Up Arms, a fitting quest title considering how I'm going to be punching my way through this quest line. Vilkas says I'm not the worst, but says I'm a bitch, and gives me his sword to give to Yorland. Yorland says that Vilkas is hazing us, and we proceed to ask who's in charge, and he again says there's no leader, but Kodlak is just an advisor. Yeah, bullshit. He literally just leads the faction. Anyways, he said he needs our help, and we say yes, where he responds, that's a good man. Knowing where this quest goes, it'd be funny if this is our first piece of foreshadowing towards the lycanthropy thing, after eavesdropping on Vilkas and Kodlak. Anyway, we take Ayla's shield to her, and she asks if we could beat Vilkas in a fight, and Jaraza says he doesn't care for boasting. Why? Because he's too small-brained for that. All fist, no thoughts. To talk is to spend time not punching, and Jaraza doesn't do that. Farkas shows us to our room, and then he gives us a job. Our job's to be some muscle and scare our target. Arcadia? The sweet lady who sells potions in Whiterun? No, this is just a symptom of Radiant quest design. Unfortunately, the companions are heavily dependent on doing Radiant quests to progress through the story. Anyway, we beat up Arcadia and get trapped in dialogue before she says we have rattles, and we leave. Leaving Arcadia's is the beginning of the Greymane quest line, which Jaraza will be doing because his work buddy Yorland and his wife would be sad if we didn't. But first, we return to the hall and turn in our quest. Once we turn it in, Farkas tells us that Sjor wants us, and we get tasked with our initiation mission. Retrieve a fragment of Uthrad, the ancient axe of Ysgramor, from Dustman's Cairn, a pretty generic Nordic ruin. This starts Proving Honor. We walk over to Dustman's Cairn from Whiterun, which is a pretty uneventful journey. We walk in, and Farkas mentions that someone's already been here. Like I said, for the most part, this is just a standard Nork ruin. We go around punching a bunch of Draugr, basically, until eventually we reach a point where I pull a lever and get stuck. Then, our faction's main enemy, the Silver Hand, arrive. The Silver Hand are a group of werewolf hunters unique to Skyrim, who kind of just have this strange personal beef with the companions. It's never really elaborated upon. I know some people theorize that they're an offshoot branch of the companions that formed whenever a certain group of people didn't want to take the curse of lycanthropy, but that's all speculation. We don't have anything solid. But anyway, they surround us, and one of them makes mentions of saying, if he wears that armor, he dies. Which is weird because he's not wearing companion's armor. He's wearing steel armor. Anyways, Farkas turns into a werewolf and beats up every member of the Silver Hand present. He frees us, and just like an idiot, we go, oh, you're gonna make me a werewolf? And Farkas says, no, that's only for people who are in the circle. Spoiler alert, that's literally 2 quests from now. The rest of the dungeon is pretty standard affair, just running through fighting both Silver Hands and Draugr. We finally reach the end where we learn a word of fire breath, as well as retrieve a fragment of Wuthrad. Once we get the fragment, a bunch of Draugr attack in waves and we have to fight them off. We return to Jorrvaskr and are fully initiated into the faction by the Circle. Farkas calls us his homie and everyone thinks we're cool now. We get access to a Skyforge weapon, that we don't use in this playthrough, and get to ask Kodlak about the lycanthropy issue where he calmly explains that the Circle are werewolves and how he and Vilkas don't really know how they feel about it. Kodlak is getting old and he knows he's going to die soon. He craves Sovngarde and death, and thus wants to cure himself. We ask him about it and he says, don't worry about it, before shit-talking our gear and sending us on our way. We do one more Radiant quest before Skjor asks us to meet him at the Underforge at night. He asks us if we are prepared and tells us we're getting a gift. He cuts Isla's arm in some sort of weird furry foreplay and tells us to drink her blood, probably another kink thing. We tell him we're into it and we take a sippy. We then go on a rampage and wake up to Ayla congratulating us. She then sends us up the hill to Gallows Rock, home to a group of Silver Hand. Skjor went ahead, hint hint foreshadowing, so we transform and go crazy, go stupid on him. Ayla tells us that the werewolves inside are wild and not worth saving, and warns us as Krev the Skinner, a randomly generated boss enemy. It's kind of unfortunate that a major boss of the questline is just some random bandit chief enemy who actually respawns when you leave and come back. That aside, Ayla sees that Skjor is dead and wants to send us on her own quest of vengeance. Our first target is a group of Silver Hand in the Rift with a fragment of Wuthrad. But first, let's take a pit stop and discuss werewolves. Werewolves are one of the classic monster enemy types in fantasy. They and vampires, which we will discuss in a later video, are the most popular monsters in the fantasy genre by a very long margin. And werewolves in Skyrim are your typical beasties. Contrary to some reviews of Skyrim, I think werewolves are done pretty well. You aren't just some guy who can shapeshift into a dog in the full moon. You're a force of nature who can rip anything to pieces in a few slashes. Is it unfortunate that it's faction-locked? Yeah. But do I hate it? Not really. I get it. You want players to be incentivized to play the faction. But the issue arises when you don't let people progress through the storyline unless they choose to become a werewolf in the first place. Now, this wouldn't be an issue if this wasn't the only Fighters Guild equivalent in the game. You can't play an honor-bound knight or a holy good paladin because a holy good paladin or an honor-bound knight literally would not choose to become a violent werewolf that tears people apart at every full moon. It directly kills your role-playing potential in that way. But back to the transformation itself, in base Skyrim, it was pretty lame. It didn't really do much, and the damage really dropped off over time. If that were how it stayed, I wouldn't have liked it in the first place. But after Dawnguard released, the werewolves got a touch-up and got 11 new perks as well as different beast roars that have additional effects. This is what makes them the violent force of nature I was talking about, and not just Fighters Guild mutts. But while I still have some time, we're also going to take a detour to talk about the Silver Hand. You would think the primary antagonists of the companions would get some semblance of ceremony, but if you thought that, you haven't been playing Bethesda games as of Oblivion. Ever since the Necromancers and the Mages Guild of Oblivion, if a faction needs enemies in a Bethesda game, just create a generic group of baddies to fight. The Silver Hand is literally just bandits. They are randomly generated, they use the bandit pseudonyms, they use the bandit loot tables. The only difference between the Silver Hand and bandits is that they use silver weaponry. They have no unique lore. Speculation is key to Bethesda's new lore philosophy, and that is the only thing they have going for them. It's unfortunate we couldn't get anything real for them. I really do like the idea of a faction turned against its base by the werewolf divide, and I think it would have made the faction more interesting as a result, but it's not really canon. It's just a thing made up by the Fudge Muppet Boys, and I think also Camelworks, to make it more spiced up. Well, anyway, while I was talking about this on screen, you can see I've been doing a little trolling to the Silver Hand, and Kodlak says he needs to talk to us. When we get to Jorvaskr, Kodlak tells us that we need to get our shit together, and that we avenged Skjor about 20 murders ago. Then he starts going on about the curse of lycanthropy and how the witches of Glenmoral, the Deus Ex Machina of the Elder Scrolls universe, cursed them with the beast blood, and that he wishes to be cured of his beast blood to go to Sovngarde. He says we need to kill them and get their heads in order to be able to cure the beast blood, but then he also says make sure you kill all of them as repentance for what they've done, literally just after telling us that a quest of vengeance is a bad idea. We do get the heads, and then we return to Jorvaskr to find that the Silver Hand attacked in retaliation and killed Kodlak while we were gone. Vilkas gets onto us for not being there, even though we were on Kodlak's orders, but I understand why, though. It's clear that Vilkas and Kodlak were the closest in the faction, and then had a bit of a father-son dynamic. But now, again, we go on another revenge mission. Anyways, Vilkas and I head off to Driftshade Refuge to wipe out the rest of the Silver Hand and get our fragments back. It's really just a simple bandit dungeon followed by a funeral for Kodlak. Not much to say about it, because it isn't really much in the first place. But that puts us directly into the next quest, Glory to the Dead. We have the funeral at the Skyforge, where we give Kodlak the good old Jedi funeral treatment, and Yorlin walks up to us and grabs the fragments from us. He then says to go into Kodlak's room, and we get the last fragment. There we do find the fragment and Kodlak's journal. In it, we read that he fights Hircine in the spirit world with the assistance of a stranger, that stranger being us. He also writes about how Skjor and Aela do not want a cure, but Vilkas does, and that Farkas is a bit of a fence-sitter on the issue, but ultimately will probably do whatever Vilkas wants to do. He also notes that he, Vilkas, and Farkas were not going to transform until basically the day they died. He then talks about how meeting us, and how we were the stranger his dreams told him about, but that he couldn't give it away to anyone yet. After we close his journal, we pick up that piece of Wuthrad and take it to Yorland, who's currently hiding in a bush. He then directs us to go meet Aela, Vilkas, and Farkas in the Underforge, where they're currently arguing about whether or not they should even try to cure Kodlak in his post-death state. Aela, being Aela, is trying to argue that the gift of beast blood is something you shouldn't throw away, but Vilkas and Farkas, being, good people, say that we should honor his wish and cure him even if he's already dead. Then they discuss that it's a moot point anyways, because they can't get into the Tomb of Ysgramor without Wuthrad, but that's when our boy Yorland shows up with Wuthrad in his hands. He gives it to us and sends us on our way to go into the tomb and cure Kodlak. But first, let's talk a little bit about Wuthrad. Wuthrad is an interesting piece of work, with a screaming snow elf on the head with what I'd presume to be flame engravings on the side. It has decent stats for a battle axe, but that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about how its enchantment is just especially deadly to elves, which is insane. To think that there's just a way to forge a weapon in a way that elves specifically get killed better by it is insane. But let's go beyond that. Elves aren't the most common enemy type in Skyrim. On average, most of Skyrim is populated by Nords and Redguards. The main population of elves are in the Thalmor, who we only fight a couple times in the main questline anyways. So it's kind of useless beyond, like, 2 quests. Anyways, let's get back on track. Glory of the Dead continues when we get to the Tomb of Eastermore and put Wuthrad in Eastermore's hands. Don't forget to take it back. I forgot to take it back on my first ever playthrough of Skyrim, and then was upset to find out that I could have grabbed it before. Vilkas says he's hanging back because of what happened at Driftshade. We fight through killing ghosts until eventually Farkas said that he's staying back because he's scared of spiders for some reason. We then body slam, choke slam, and shoulder throw a few more ghosts and spiders until we meet Kodlak's ghost. He said he's there with all the other Harbingers evading Hircine, but we can only see him because he's the only one we know. We then tell him he can be cured, so we put the head in the fire and kill his inner wolf spirit, which we do most of the damage to while it's still spawning. We then tell Kodlak he's free as if he wouldn't know, and he says he might gather some heroes in Sovngarde to save the other Harbingers from Hircine. He then names us Harbinger. Ayla asks if we are Harbinger even though she was literally right next to us, and she says that we earned it. And that right there is where the questline really comes to an end. There are side quests that revolve around getting totems as well as curing Vilkas and Farkas, but I didn't do that in this playthrough because it bugged out for me and I chose to just keep my sanity. And on the topic of sanity, this is where today's episode of Smoke and the Possum Pack comes to an end. Overall, my review of the companions is that it's just kind of mid. If they would have taken just a second to actually flesh out the quest line, the story, and even the Silver Hand just a little bit, maybe it would have been a good quest line. It's not offensively bad, but there's nothing redeemable about it either. It is the textbook definition of mid. It is a solid 5 to 6 out of 10 quest line, and that would be fine if there weren't any bad quest lines in Skyrim. Unfortunately, there are, and that's what I'm going to be talking about the next Smoke in the Possum Pack episode when I discuss the College of Winterhold. Anyways, thank you all for a Smoke in the Possum Pack today, and I hope to see you guys next time.